They give you a 10-minute.
What did you say, Tom?
So on Broadway, they give you 10 minutes before they start the show.
This is off Broadway, Tom.
Quite.
All right, we're at 7:32. Want to welcome everyone.
Okay, they're just going to miss the introduction, but anytime you join in is fine.
All right, so let me introduce our speaker tonight and welcome everyone who's joined us for this special presentation. Many of you know Sylvia. Our speaker tonight is Sylvia Flescher, who is a psychiatrist with a private practice based in Ridgewood, New Jersey. A graduate of Barnard College, she got her MD from New York Medical College and then trained in psychiatry at Mount Sinai in New York City. She graduated from analytic training at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. She lives now with Tom in Glen Rock, and they moved there from Ridgewood, where they raised their two daughters, Rebecca and Sophia. Sylvia and Tom have been members of Temple Israel for nearly 3 decades. And Sylvia is very grateful to the Temple community. She says, I feel like I've grown up at the Temple Israel. I took my first steps there as a baby writer and speaker because I felt safe and encouraged to participate in various programs at the synagogue, starting with participating in Sisterhood Shabbat and the Holocaust Interfaith Service, and being asked to be on or lead panels, and ultimately presenting an early draft of Googling for Ghosts. Temple Israel provided me with a safe space to grow more confident and comfortable with public speaking. Ritual and the healing effect of being witnessed and heard in the community have proven invaluable time and time again. So we welcome Sylvia, Sylvia Flescher is going to have her presentation this evening on the diary of her cousin's Holocaust diary found, and we'll explore some very intimate details with her and her family, and very, very, very interesting from the beginning. So Sylvia, good evening and welcome. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, so I sent that introduction to Bob because I did really want to tell everybody how much I feel like I've been nourished and encouraged to get to this place through being a member of Temple. And my Temple family really did a great deal to heal the sense of loss and loneliness that comes from being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. So I'm calling this Elsa Lost and Found. My father taught me to play chess when I was 8 years old. Whenever we'd finish a game, which he inevitably won, he'd impress upon me how important it was to count all the pieces as I returned them to the box. You must be very careful, Sylvia, he'd say. You don't want to lose anyone. I'd pair up black king and black queen, white king and white queen, castles, knights, bishops, and pawns. I thought of them as a family that needed to be kept together. I knew that my father had lost his family in something called the Holocaust. As a little girl, I thought, perhaps my daddy had lost his family because he wasn't careful enough. And I vowed to never, ever be careless, to try my best not to lose my family, because then I'd be all alone in the world. I cannot remember a time when I didn't know about the Holocaust. My sister and I simply accepted that we had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles or cousins. It was not that unusual among our classmates whose parents were also refugees from Europe. Looking back, I now understand that we tried very hard not to compound any sense of loss that my parents undoubtedly had by drawing attention to who was missing at our holiday dinners. But to quote Holocaust educator Alan Berger, there was a presence of an absence in our home. I also carried with me the scar of an interaction with my father that has haunted me for years. We were visiting the annual boat show at the New York Coliseum. I was 10 years old and thrilled to have Daddy all to myself. We left my younger sister Diana at home. A salesman began to pitch a particular sailboat my father had stopped to admire. But the salesman switched to a harsh, guttural language I didn't understand. And my father abruptly took my hand, saying, "Come, Sylvia, it's time to go home." In the taxi, I tried to puzzle out what had just happened. And my father explained through his clenched jaw. He heard my accent and thought that I was German. To my mind, it was unfair for my father to assume that the salesman had been a Nazi. And so I asked naively, but Daddy, weren't there any good Germans? My father, clearly enraged and now at me, stopped talking to me until later that day, at my mother's urging, I went to apologize to him and ask for his forgiveness. And I've always remained a bit scared to ask the wrong question. And I want to emphasize that was a traumatic memory. And when I first wrote that story, I'm talking 15 years ago, I would cry practically every time I read it. So the process of writing it and presenting it and repeating it has worked through some of the trauma, but that left me with this feeling that I could ask the wrong question and step on a landmine. My father was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. Many of his patients had, like him, suffered unimaginable trauma and loss in World War II. When I grew older, I learned that their treatment was often paid for by the German government as part of reparations. Now, my father hadn't actually been in a concentration camp. He hadn't experienced firsthand the effects of Nazi brutality. I never heard him wake up screaming from nightmares. But he often spoke of his childhood friend, Joseph Bibring, who had emigrated to Palestine before World War II. My father would say, Bibring is the only person alive who knew me before the age of 24. Try as I might, I was unable to wrap my head around this. How was it possible that his entire family, along with all his friends and neighbors in his hometown in Poland, had been exterminated, but he alone had survived? As a child, I sensed my father's deep sadness and also his quiet rage. What I could not understand until much later was how he struggled with survivor guilt. I understand, I think, that he coped with his survivor guilt by being a workaholic, by compulsively writing and working, seeing his patients. My father was born in 1906 into a moderately observant Jewish family in the town of Buchach, Poland, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After a few years, the family moved to the small town of Stanislavov. A very bright and ambitious young man, my father knew at an early age that he wanted to become a doctor and then a psychiatrist. He was inspired by the writings of a Jewish doctor from Vienna, Sigmund Freud, who was shaking things up with some radical ideas about human sexuality, the importance of dreams, and the existence of the unconscious. Because of the quota limiting how many Jews could study medicine at Polish universities, my father left home for Vienna to pursue his medical degree. Struggling with depression, he was very homesick. He also hoped to consult with Freud himself, denying the reality that he had not one extra zloty to pay for treatment. At the university in Vienna, he witnessed Nazi sympathizers throw Jewish students down the stairs while the police stood by. By some miracle, he was spared being attacked himself, but he vividly described to me examples of the blatant anti-Semitism of many professors. After completing his studies, my father returned to Poland and to his family, only to discover the Jews were not being given any opportunity to practice medicine in Poland. He therefore decided to move to Italy for his psychiatric training and eventually hung out his shingle in Rome in 1936. On the 1st of September 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, slaughtering thousands of Poles who fought valiantly, but whose firepower was dwarfed by that of Hitler's military. 1 week earlier, Hitler and Stalin had secretly signed a non-aggression pact, agreeing to remain allies by splitting Poland between them. Thus, my relatives, my father's family, living in the eastern part of Poland, fell under Soviet rule for 2 years until in 1941, Hitler broke his promise to Stalin and declared war on Russia. My family in Stanislavov then came under Nazi control in the so-called General Gouvernement. My father in Italy kept sending weekly care packages to his family, not knowing if they ever actually received any of them. With mounting desperation, he used the connections of his high-status patients to wrangle an audience with the Pope, begging him to intervene and get his family out of Poland. But the pontiff only declared his own helplessness, saying, "You know, they are killing our priests too." My father has a little story about that too, which is that the Pope sort of expected him to kneel or bow and kiss his ring. And my father didn't do that. And afterwards, he could have beat himself up wondering if he had done that, would the Pope have helped more? My father even managed to get a petition to Mussolini himself, only to get it back with this scrawled comment in Il Duce's handwriting on the top: "This is no time for Jews." Eventually, my father got word that his entire family, over 40 relatives, had all perished. Indeed, that there were no Jews at all left in Stanislavov, the first Polish city to be declared Judenfrei, free of Jews. My grandmother and my 2 aunts had tried to escape dressed as peasants, but were discovered and shot in the back at the railway station. One of my aunt's husband and their small daughter witnessed this and somehow escaped, only to be killed later. I have no idea how the rest of the family met their end. In September of 1943, the Nazis occupied Rome, and my father had to go into hiding. My mother, Anna, had been his secretary, and then they had become lovers. They shared an apartment on Via Flaminia. Swiss-born and not Jewish, my mother courageously helped my father pull off a daring scheme to hide him in their apartment, declaring to the authorities that he had decamped and that she had no idea where he was. Hiding a Jew was a crime punishable by death. In 2008, a few months before she died, my mother was honored at Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations for hiding my father and saving his life. My parents emigrated from Italy to the US a few years after the war ended and were married. Born in 1952, I grew up on Manhattan's Upper East Side. My father practiced psychiatry from his office in our apartment. It was the time of the Cold War, and the threat of nuclear annihilation hung in the air. My father wrote and self-published a passionate treatise entitled Nazi Holocaust and Mankind's Final Solution, seeking to derive some lesson from the Holocaust that would alert mankind to its potential for self-destruction. Our kitchen table was covered by books about the war against the Jews. But for all that he was immersed in the subject, I never saw my father mourn specific relatives, or light a yahrzeit candle, or recite the Kaddish prayer for the dead. My father was a passionate Zionist, but following Freud, he had a dim view of organized religion and saw no need for ritual. We never constructed a family tree, nor named the dead, nor teased out the web of connections. No doubt that would have made my father's losses too real and too specific, perhaps only intensifying his survivor guilt. But I, on the other hand, found myself drawn to ritual and to Judaism. I devoured books on the history of the Jews, reading Leon Uris's Exodus 4 times. I believe I filled the emptiness of no extended family by identifying with the larger Jewish family. I had complied with my father's dream for me to become a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, but I felt very differently than him when it came to the importance of community and my strong need to affiliate with like-minded souls. When I learned that by Jewish law, I would not be considered a Jew because my mother was a Gentile, I decided at the age of 18 to formally convert. Now, fast forward a few decades. On a rainy day, sometime in 2003, as I was rummaging through papers in the storage room of my office, I came upon an aged, unlabeled cardboard box and discovered a treasure: letters from my grandfather Kalman, my grandmother Sala, and my 2 aunts, Zofka and Gusta, to my father in Vienna and Rome. Oh, you know what? This is when I maybe should stop and show some pictures, Bob, if you can. I'll show the pictures. The first one is of my father when he was in Italy in his medical coat. Looking a little like a dashing, dashing Italian. And the next one is of my mother. I think she looks a little bit like Greta Garbo there. And then the next one is of my grandparents, Kalman and Sala. And the next one, I think, is of my aunt Zofka and her baby Emma. Okay, thank you, Bob. Then I'll go back now to the story, to my presentation. Okay. Okay, so I found these letters. Some of the envelopes were stamped with a Nazi eagle, which were marked General Gouvernement and had clearly passed through censorship. Astonishingly, before my father died of pancreatic cancer in 1976, he'd never told us of this trove of letters from his family. It still terrifies me to think how easily these letters could have been lost over several of my family's moves. The letters needed translating, and I procrastinated about getting that done. I feared stirring up an even greater sense of loss. Surely the words of my grandmother and my aunts would make them come alive again, and I'd need to mourn them in a new, more painful way. Until then, they had been an abstraction. Reading their letters would be like hearing their voices. My sister and I did eventually arrange to have the letters translated by the staff members of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and then we donated many of the letters to the museum's archives for safekeeping and for future study. One of the most heartbreaking letters was dated 12/22/41. In it, my Aunt Zofka in Stanislavov wrote to my father in Rome, asking him not to be angry with them for not telling him sooner how ill their father was. That is my grandfather, Kalman Flescher. Kalman had died, and presumably my father had written to his family expressing his anger at feeling deprived of the chance to come home to see his father one last time before his death, or at least to attend a funeral service. In 2004, I attended a panel at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. The subject was Writing Our Parents' War. I heard Irene Kikandis read from her book, Daddy's War, and resonated with her concept of a para-memoir, which is not just the story, but the story of how you found out the story, para-memoir. I reached out to her and she encouraged me, and I went on to begin to tell my own story. And that's how Googling for Ghosts came about, which I presented for the very first time at Temple, the early draft. So in 2012, to my great pleasure, that paper was actually published in a psychoanalytic journal. I called Googling for Ghosts a meditation on writer's block, mourning, and the Holocaust. In it, I explored my conflict over feeling that it was my duty to write about my father's losses. I resented the way the Holocaust chronically overshadowed my life. I resonated with the title of Israeli psychologist Ilana Kogan's book, The Cry of Mute Children. And I understood my writer's block as a struggle against muteness. Did I have the right to write my own story? Because the idea is that you think your story is dwarfed by the trauma and the horrific scale of your parents' story. If I wrote about my murdered relatives, it felt to me like they were continuing to take over my life. But if I did not write about them, wasn't I killing them off again? In that essay, I recounted the powerful experience of the Yad Vashem ceremony honoring my mother. Having thus entered my parents' story into the public record, I hoped that I would feel somewhat freed of the burden to memorialize my family's losses. In writing that piece, I realized for the first time that I'd always thought of those who died in the Holocaust as my father's relatives, but they were my grandparents, my aunts, my cousins. But then I was invited to be on a panel at a conference sponsored by the Holocaust Education Foundation, a community of Holocaust scholars I hadn't even known existed. I wrote about discovering the letters and what that meant to me. At the conference, which meets every 2 years, I felt that I'd found my tribe. Here were others immersed in the subject of the Holocaust. I felt less alone, more connected. For many years, I put off making a so-called roots trip to Poland because I felt it would be too depressing. At the urging of my new colleagues, I decided that I was ready to join the Holocaust Education Foundation trip to Poland, the Czech Republic, and Germany. This trip, which was offered every summer as part of their mission to train scholars and teachers in the history of the Holocaust, was planned around visits to several death camps, ghettos, and memorial museums. Supported and encouraged by the unique academic community of HEF, Holocaust Education Foundation, I felt ready at last to explore the part of the world where my father's family had lived and had perished. It felt like a mitzvah, a duty. I convinced my husband, Tom, to come with me. It was time to become more educated and less hazy about many details of the Holocaust. I'm sure you know that with trauma comes an impact on your ability to think. And I would say that I truly did have trouble keeping certain facts in my mind. I kept wanting to pull away from them. I needed to see the actual geography of the land. And I began to be interested in learning not just how my relatives had died there, but also how they had lived there. Anticipating this trip made me pay attention in a new, invigorated way. I felt as if I was waking up from a sort of low-level brain fog. As I studied a map of Poland, I came upon names I'd heard all my life: Uchach, Stanislavov, Yaremche, the mountain resort town where the Flescher family had vacationed. I realized that these places had taken on a mythical quality like Brigadoon, but here they were on the map, the actual towns in black and white. So now I'm going to tell you about our trip. Our first stop was Treblinka, not far from Warsaw, the death camp where 900,000 people were murdered. The camp buildings were all destroyed by the retreating Nazis, but in their place, a huge field of jagged memorial stones stretches over dozens of acres. Each stone is inscribed with the name of a village, a town, a city. Our guide helped me to find the large stone for Stanislavov, and I placed a small stone on its top as a Jewish mourning ritual. The next day, we toured the Warsaw Ghetto and the one synagogue still standing. There had been 300 before the war. The Nazis had turned the elegant temple into a stable for their horses. But most impressive to me was the Jewish cemetery. Here was evidence of the Jews living in Warsaw for centuries, of prosperous families erecting monuments to their dead. Here were the graves of over 250,000 Jews who had died of natural causes over more than 200 years. The day before, we'd walked through a place where nearly 4 times as many people had been killed in less than 2 years, and their bodies reduced to ashes, the victims remaining nameless, deprived of any civilized society's respectful treatment of the dead. The contrast between Treblinka and the Warsaw Jewish cemetery could not have been more stark. In the days that followed, we visited several other infamous death camps and moving memorials. In the very new and very impressive Museum of the Jews in Poland, I was deeply gratified to see all the signs in 3 languages: Polish, English, and yes, Hebrew. Hitler thought he was going to wipe the Jews from the face of the earth, and here the ancient Hebrew language continues to be alive and well. In the end, the trip exceeded my expectations. My worldview had been enormously expanded. My knowledge of the historical facts and the geography of the region deepened. I told people that it had been a transformative experience. I did not know just how transformative it would turn out to be. A few weeks after our return from Europe, my husband and I drive up to our lake house in the Adirondacks, where my family has spent summers since the early 1950s. My father always said this area in upstate New York reminded him of the Carpathian Mountains in Poland, where he had vacationed with his family. Across the lake, a friend of ours, Karen Cohen Holmes, listens closely as we recount the powerful experiences of our recent trip. When she hears we're traveling the following week to Montreal, Karen says excitedly, "Well, then you must meet my dear friend, Andrea Axt, who lives there. She also comes from a Holocaust background. She lived for many years in Poland after the war and has worked on translating diaries written during the Holocaust. I know you'll have a lot to talk about." Andrea and I exchange emails and we agree to meet for Sunday brunch. She has chosen a restaurant with a name that makes me giggle, L'Enfant Terrible, It's a lovely summer morning. As Tom and I approach the outdoor tables placed under a colorful awning, we somehow recognize one another immediately. She's a petite woman in her late 70s with reddish curly hair and a vivacious manner, yet I detect an underlying sadness. I've barely sat down when Andrea takes a slim purple volume out of her pocketbook and hands it to me. Its title, Two Diaries from Witnesses and Victims of Extermination of the Jews in Stanislavov, the very city my father came from. I look more closely at the cover and read the names of the two diarists at the top. One is Elsa Binder Elisheva. Wait, my world tips slightly. Binder? But that was my grandmother's maiden name. She was, I tell Andrea, Sala Binder Flescher. Then certainly you are related, Andrea says excitedly. Binder is not that common a name. My head is spinning. I try to take in some of the details Andrea is providing us. Elsa's notebook was found in July 1943 in a ditch by the side of Batory Street in Stanislavov. This is the street that leads to the Jewish cemetery, which is where the Nazis performed mass executions of the local Jews. A high school teacher was riding by on his bicycle and spied it. I wait to read the actual first entry of the diary until later that day when we return, exhausted from sightseeing, to our little Airbnb. As I open the book to the first page, I'm aware that I feel anxious. Am I hopeful that this diary, this voice from the tragic past, will shed light on my family's fate? What if there is no connection and I'll be disappointed, sorry that I've gotten my hopes up? On the other hand, what if there is a connection and I will learn some awful details about how my grandmother and my aunts Zofka and Gusta met their end? I take a deep breath and begin to read. First comes Andrea's introduction, telling us that Elsa was 22 years old on the date of the last entry to the diary, which is June 18th, 1942. This is when Elsa probably perished in a roundup of victims, a so-called axia. She and her parents were likely transported to Belzec and gassed. So here's a mystery. If the diary was found a full year later, how did it survive the snows of a Polish winter and the melting that spring would have brought, surely blurring, if not erasing, the ink? Perhaps Elsa entrusted the diary to someone who placed it there a year later in a spot where someone would be certain to see it. Or someone who moved into their vacated apartment discovered it and felt compelled to anonymously ensure it survived, even if its youthful author did not. So many questions with no one to supply the answers. I turn the page to a map of Stanislavov. I search for street names that correspond to addresses on the envelopes of the letters from my father's family, but the writing is too small. Then comes a sample of Elsa's handwriting in Polish, so much like the many letters from my family hidden for decades in that old cardboard box. I turn the page and read the first entry. December 23rd, 41. Yesterday, my aunt, tears in her eyes, brought over a letter from her son in Italy. Wait, I read the line again. A letter from her son in Italy? Can this really be? I'm dumbfounded. The son in Italy that Elsa refers to in these opening lines can only be my father. At that moment, I realize that I'm holding in my hands the diary of my father's first cousin, and the aunt she refers to is my grandmother, Sala. So I continue to read that first entry. Yesterday, my aunt, tears in her eyes, brought over a letter from her son in Italy. In it, he complains that he wasn't told earlier of his father's illness. In his innocence, he claims he would have come to save his father straight into the jaws of the lion. And this is the first example of Elsa's characteristic sarcasm. He asks that flowers be taken to the grave. How little idea he has of our conditions. Elsa is referring to my father's reaction upon hearing of the death of my grandfather Kalman. She must have realized that her cousin in Italy, my father, had absolutely no clue as to how dire the circumstances in the Stanislavov ghetto are. Otherwise, how could he possibly ask that flowers be put on his father Kalman's grave? How could he think, had he known earlier of his father's condition, that he'd have been able to come to see him? And realizing how little the outside world knows of their suffering, Elsa begins to write intensely over the next 6 months an eyewitness account of the day-to-day conditions endured in the ghetto. Did my father's letter, with its challenging tone, inspire her to bear witness? I can only speculate. The day after that first entry, all the Jews are forced into a ghetto area of the city. What's so amazing is that if Elsa had not begun her diary with those lines referring to my father's letter, I could have read the entire notebook without knowing that or how we were related, which still boggles my mind that I might not have known. Here I have selected some excerpts from Elsa Binder's diary. December 27, 1941. Like thunder from the sky, a decree fell on us that Jews must, under penalty of death, give up all furs and pieces of fur. The cheaper ones were taken long ago. To make sure that the order will be followed, a few dozen hostages were taken. I look at my threadbare coat, which has the wind for a lining, and I wonder whether the Germans, caught off guard by the winter, intend to dress their troops in Jewish furs. I think that if everyone's furs are as pitiful as mine, I don't envy the Germans. Elsa often uses sarcasm. She refers to literary texts and Latin words. She's smart, educated, clear-eyed, and matter-of-fact.
You're muted. You're muted, Sylvia.
Go back a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Give me a second. I got to find my thing.
You're
Okay.
good now.
Okay. That was weird. Okay. Elsa often uses sarcasm. She refers to literary texts and Latin words. She's smart, educated, clear-eyed, and matter-of-fact. In between episodes of heartbreaking suffering, she also confides the more mundane preoccupations of family life, using that her mother loves her younger sister, Dora, more than her. The next entry I'm selecting is from December 31st, 1941. Now, I was born on December 31st. And so I realize when I read this entry, I was born only 11 years from the date that this was written, and it kind of brings home to me with a shock how recent my father's losses were on the day that I was born. Today is New Year's Eve, the last day of 1941. That also means the end of my 21st year, still embattled with the gods. They've endowed me with a face that basically makes no good impression, and a set of rounded shoulders that are even less exciting. As it stands, all Jewish girls share the same fate. Neither death nor prison considers one's looks. Many of my peers, so much more naturally endowed than I, have gone to their fate. And I, as we all stand in the face of death, desire life, but am not afraid. I'm not sure whether all my dear ones who are dead might not be better off than I am today or will be tomorrow. I see them every night, still together, just as when they left, lying together, happy and laughing, and above all, free, truly free for now and forever. She's referring here to the mass grave from the massacre known as Bloody Sunday. It's an icy winter. Bony fingered frost knocks on the window. We have coal for only a week and food to last a month. What are you bringing me, long awaited 1942? I greet you, 1942. May you bring salvation and victory. May you be the first year of grace for this ancient and unlucky race. whose fate lies in the hands of the unjust. And one more thing, whatever you bring from me, be it life or death, bring it quickly. 3 days later, she writes, the evenings are the worst. At 7 p.m., following orders to shut off lights, the whole family goes to bed. Only I waste a candle by which to read or write. Later, I go to my unheated room and to a bed warmed by a brick, and there I have a chance to think about my life. Life? I doubt that you could even call it life. Vegetating? Not that either. I do think, feel, and suffer. Everything in me is just one chord of pain and hope. Yes, I want to live. I want to eat well. Butter is a legend to me, and milk a distant memory of the past. I want to dress well. I can't remember the last time I did. I want intellectual stimulation. And here comes the last and dearest wish. I want to love and be loved. This is the law of nature. It's sad, but it's healthy. My God, at the fresh grave of my peers, here I am dreaming of such trivial things. On January 12th, the 3-month anniversary of so-called Bloody Sunday, when 12,000 Jews were rounded up and executed into a mass grave, here are her words. And I'm sorry, this is hard to listen to, I know. I don't even know how you died. Did a sadist brick tossed into a crowd hit you? Were you smothered by masses of people retreating to save themselves? Perhaps a well-aimed shot in the breast, and then you were swallowed in the huge common grave. Oh God, what if you were slightly wounded, but lay slowly dying in a pile of corpses? And she continues the next day. The number of victims ranges between 10 and 12,000. Mother Earth cried over them. The wind moaned. The tops of trees bent their branches, and the cloudy sky cried rain and snow. The victims were accompanied by cries and moaning and the mighty call of Shema Yisrael. And God was silent. Mothers were left without children, children without mothers. Houses and apartments stood empty, and hearts were left hardened by pain, hate, and helplessness. But in my heart, strangely, there is no hate, only pain, shock, and the universal why. How could sons of mothers and fathers of children drive proud wrinkled elders, whimpering babies, healthy youths, and pregnant women to the cemetery where fresh common graves were waiting? Was it in the name of the love that their religion teaches that they forced mothers to smother their children in the terrible crush and children to trample their mothers? Supposedly, international law demands that criminals and spies sentenced to death by shooting be blindfolded so that they need not look death in the face. But here, little children clinging to their mothers cry, "Mama, make me go first. I don't want to see when they kill you." These children are not only made to face death directly, but they get to see how one can hold a pistol in one hand and a cigarette in the other. They also see how mothers tell their children about death and how they prepare them for it. And when they cry, "Mama, we want so badly to live," she cries out, "Children, since this is not given to us, we will die together." I'm almost done. She can see an infant's head crushed under a sadist boot and rifles pointed at pregnant bellies. The crowd is silent. Perhaps it's praying. I can't understand why, with their great number, they didn't hurl themselves upon the murderers. It is said they feared for all the others who are spread throughout the territories. If this is true, how noble and brave. Every time I read these words, I need to fight the urge to look away. I think that my enduring ambivalence about immersing myself in the horrors of the Holocaust results from being saddled too young with the duty to compensate my father for his losses. The Israeli psychologist Dina Wardi said it best when she called children of survivors memorial candles. But I don't want to be anyone's memorial candle. Elsa has helped me to not look away. My sense of being alone with the Holocaust trauma has gradually been mitigated over the past decade by several key events. First, the Yad Vashem ceremony, then writing about it in Googling for Ghosts, then joining the Holocaust Education Foundation community, then going on the Roots trip, and ultimately discovering Elsa and her diary. This chain of events beautifully exemplifies the Buddhist saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I feel that the universe has given me a precious gift. Ironically, while I was mourning, not having any evidence of my lost relatives, academics had been teaching the diary for 20 years. Excerpts had been published in Alexander Zapruder's collection, Salvaged Pages. My father died without knowing that his cousin's diary had survived. Would it have been a comfort, I wonder, or instead painful evidence of how his family suffered? Of one thing I can be certain, he would be pleased at the sustained scholarship that is being devoted to studying and teaching the Holocaust. Bob, can you show the picture, the next picture? This is a picture, there are two photographs of Elsa. She was known as Elisheva to her Zionist youth group. There, this is a group here. Can we see that? So this is her in the center. And if you notice the uniform, it's the uniform of the Hashomer Hatzair youth group. And then if you show the next one, that's my aunt Gusta, and she's wearing a very similar uniform with that beautiful face. Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's all that we need to show. So Elsa's last name, she was known as Elisheva because that was the only thing that was written on the diary. Her last name remained unknown for a long time. When parts of the diary was translated into Hebrew by a member of Kibbutz Sha'ar Ha'amakim, another kibbutz member recognized Elisheva as the name given to Elsa Binder in their shared Hasomer Hatzair Zionist youth group. Now, if I Google Elsa Binder, I get several links. Her diary appears in an MTV documentary called I'm Still Here, based on the Zapruder anthology. The psychoanalyst Hans Lowald has written some much quoted words about the necessary process of turning ghosts into ancestors in order to live more comfortably with one's personal history. Ghosts haunt us, ancestors connect us. No doubt the fact that my mother was not Jewish had left me yearning to connect with female Jewish ancestors to counterbalance my father's outsized influence on my development. And Elsa has appeared to do just that. How I wish I could have met Elsa when she was alive, but at least now I can hear her voice and connect with her intelligent and soulful spirit. And what a writer she is. She's become the representative of all the relatives I never knew. Her eloquent words underscore what I've been cheated of, but they serve to fill in some small way the emptiness from my past. I feel proud that Elsa's DNA lives on in me. Now, when I sit down to write, I feel empowered by her, that I'm carrying on a family tradition, that somehow Elsa's spirit is being channeled through me. There are no graves for my murdered relatives. I cannot place a pebble on their headstones, but the diary of Elsa, my gifted second cousin, lives on. It's a comfort to know that telling her story, I'm helping to keep her from being forgotten. Thank you.
That was amazing, Sylvia. Truly amazing. Difficult to listen to, but necessary to listen to. Do any of our participants wish to have a question for Sylvia or a comment? Please unmute yourself and do.
Just an amazing story.
Sylvia, you have the rare experience of reconnecting with relatives, going back into the past and making a connection as if they could speak to you, and making this circle of relationships that become as a surprise. It's stepping back, something that often I imagine we all think about what it was like for our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, and you get a slice of life, and you got that slice. As tragic as it may be, the eloquence of her writing and her struggle have found a voice in you. And that's an amazing piece. And to share this, and the sharing that you've done to this point, to the audiences that have heard it, have been extremely fortunate in understanding that. In our crazy world and all its trials, tribulations, and tragedies, this kind of a conversation gives us a sense of balance and reflection to think about what's important. So I'm truly impressed and delighted that you were able to bring this forward.
Well, thank you, Bob. Tova?
I have a question. Did you ever discover, were there any relatives at all who survived? Or was it just you and your parents and you, or were there any cousins or anything else that you learned of?
No, we've never, my sister and I, we've done the, Jewish gen.
Right.
I mean, it's possible that somewhere down the line, somebody's gonna reach out on some third or fourth cousin once removed. Maybe there'll be, but nobody from my father's immediate family. But the thing that my sister and I both have such a hard time grappling with is why he would never have made a list for us of actually the people in his life, and why he would not have told us about these letters. I mean, I tell you, I shudder to think that they could easily have just been lost. There was nothing to label that box as precious.
How do you view it through your psychiatric lens?
I think my father threw all of his mourning into a more abstract and intellectual pursuit. So he wrote about the Holocaust. He wrote about psychoanalytic ideas and his psychotherapeutic practice, but it was distanced. He had a lot of patients who suffered through the Holocaust. As I said, he had patients that the German reparations, they were paying for his therapy. So I thought he probably was re-traumatized all the time. And then he kept writing about it, but he didn't personalize it. And that is, for my sister and me, a great sadness. And that's why Elsa coming along feels like such a, gift from someone.
Right. Well, it does sound like trauma in your father's life would not allow him to share or go back or reflect. And it's a door that he didn't want to open, the same way he didn't want to open that box of letters.
Right.
And bring them forward. The fact that he didn't destroy them is...
He died at 69 in 1976. Right. And the flourishing of talking about the Holocaust really only started around then. So I'd like to think that maybe if he had lived another 10 years or so, 20 years, hopefully, that he might have found a context in which to talk more about it. But, there was, in the 50s and 60s, people did not talk about the Holocaust.
Right, I hear stories about that, but you're right. Maybe that if time had he been given the gift of time, you could have helped him work with that or deal with that.
Right.
Experience that.
I think so.
But extraordinary. And I do appreciate your time and effort to make this again. And it's a very well.
It's a tikkun and a mitzvah for me to be able to tell the story. So yeah, if anybody else wants to react or ask a question, or Meryl.
Sylvia, how did you feel about going back to Germany or visiting Germany?
So it helped a lot to do it within the context of this group, because I was kind of scared to do it. But by the time we got to Berlin, I mean, I felt that the Germans led the way in terms of trying to, make amends. I mean, they're that huge field in the middle of memorial in the middle of Berlin. I think that, and everywhere you look, there's those stumbling blocks that give you names of victims. So I liked Berlin, and I, did not feel that I had to continue my father's, hatred of everything German, because I don't believe we can hate the grandchildren of the Nazis. I mean, they suffered too. World War II was a cataclysm for many people. I even feel, I know people say, oh, the Germans were bad. Well, the Polish were worse and the Ukrainians were the worst, Yes, of course, but they were also good Poles and they were also good Ukrainians. And I tell this story when we were on the plane going to this roots trip to Poland. I was sitting next to this young man who told me a little bit about himself. And he said he was born in Mexico City, and he was, in his 18, 17, going with his school to a soccer summer week in Europe. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, well, we're going to be going to Poland." He said, "Oh, are you going to see Auschwitz?" And I felt suddenly some sympathy for the Poles. If Poland has now become synonymous with Auschwitz, that's not very nice for them, right? I mean, it was a German concentration camp. So, and I know, I know people whose parents and grandparents suffered terribly during the war in Poland. So it's important for us not to reduce, right, people to stereotypes and lump them all together.
I visited Munich in 1972. And I don't have any relatives who perished in the Holocaust. So it wasn't a topic for me that was on my mind. But we were picking up a BMW that we had purchased here, and we were picking it up in Munich. And then we were driving, we were going to drive through Austria and so forth. And that night we went to one of the beer halls in Munich. And Harvey and I looked around and we completely freaked out because, we saw all these men who were, say, 45 years old, 50 years old, going, what were they doing 15,
Yeah.
20? And the two of us said, we got to get out of here. And
Oh.
I didn't feel that way about Germany or Germans, particularly before I went, but being there in 1972 was just so freaky.
Well, I do remember my husband and I we didn't stay, we only went to see Dachau. We traveled from Switzerland to Dachau, and that would have been 1979. And I remember we took the little bus, and the German bus driver said, "Concentration camp." And we did have a very kind of, skeevish feeling. But this last time was 30 years later.
Yeah, it's a little different. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sylvia, again for reprising this story and this personal reflection that you have. Very touching, very important. Please keep sharing it. Others need to hear it. Children need to hear it. High schools need to hear it. It needs to be heard. And you give it life. So I think that's something really special. Of tragedy, you bring life to it through your words.
Yeah, and in a way, it gives us an opportunity to bear witness. I always feel when I do this, I'm bearing witness also. And so thank you.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Well, I feel sorry for my father, because neither he nor my mother understood how wonderful it is to be in community. They were loners. They were, they never affiliated with anything. And I feel like that is a powerful way that you can manage trauma and handle sadness and depression and loss, because you come together,
Right.
And so that's what I feel as I said, very grateful to Temple Israel for. I mean, I was smart enough to realize I should join, but then it's been and continues to be a fabulous community. So thank you for asking me to give this talk.
You're welcome.
Good to see all of you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank
this
you
evening.
too, Sylvia. It was really very
Remember,
special.
this will also be on our YouTube channel on synagogue.org, as we have recorded this for those listeners who could not be with us tonight. So go to synagogue.org and you'll be able to see this on in a couple of days, as we'll have it on our YouTube channel. You'll see it at the bottom of the page. So thank you all for having been part of this and being witnesses to Sylvia's story and her cousin's story. Thank you all for doing a great job, Sylvia. Thank you, and Tom, for making sure that this happened.
Good night.
Everyone, have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.